Dr. Jeremi Suri is my new favorite historian. He is a PhD from Yale who currently holds the Brown Chair of Leadership in Global Affairs at the LBJ School in Austin, Texas. He was an undergraduate at Stanford. He has written several books and edited many others for a total of about 9. He's a relatively young historian. The one thing that I find out about him is he's available to talk about just about any topic about any time. He's come to spoken with our groups on many different occasions, from China to the United Nations to current affairs, especially leadership, because he is, like I say, a chair of leadership at the LBJ School. And you might want to consider listening to his podcast, which is entitled This is Democracy. And it's interesting not only for covering current events and current affairs, but it's oriented toward young people. In fact, his co-host for his podcast is Jeremi Suri, his son. And so together they offer this and discuss various issues. Jeremi, as I mentioned, he's going to talk to us about Ukraine and tell you a little bit about his historical perspective on that issue and others. So Jeremi, thank you for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you for having me on, Shelley. I am so delighted to be with you. I always begin when I talk to Rotary, which I do a lot, by saying how much I believe in your organization, how much I've personally benefited from what you do. I can say that in many parts of my life, I've been involved with Rotary, and it's made a huge difference. The most obvious, and the one I want to talk about most for a second, is just my wife. My wife was a Rotary Ambassador Scholar in Italy when we were both undergraduates at Stanford University. She spent a year in Italy, thanks to Rotary. And it changed her life and it changed ours, because we now spend a lot of time in Italy, thanks to all the connections that she made. And so I appreciate all that you do as Rotary in building what Bob Putnam appropriately calls, right, the sinews of community capital, right, of keeping people together in this world. And that's maybe a good transition to talk about Ukraine. I'm a historian, as Shelley said. I'm a historian who writes about policy and leadership. And what we are living through now in this Ukraine war, and I heard a little bit of what you were just talking about, so I'm telling you what you know to some extent, is one of the foremost challenges to the historical order that we have built to try to bring peace to the world and stability in a difficult time already. This is one of the most historically challenging and significant attacks upon many of the assumptions and much of the work of the last 70 years. If there is one thing that we have succeeded at since the end of World War II, it has been creating a peaceful, prosperous west and center of Europe as a crucial, almost unimaginably connected part of the United States. It's a transatlantic world. It's a global world we live in, but it's still a transatlantic world. And that is a kind of anchor for the way we've thought about democracy and political stability. And that's under attack now, as it has not been since 1945. Let's just put it that way. You could argue the war in Yugoslavia was a horrible moment, and there's a lot to say about that. But this is now a fundamental attack on the European order. So I'm going to talk about 4 things that I think help to historically frame things. Again, I'm a historian who advises policymakers, and I've learned in doing that not to tell policymakers what to do, but to help provide a historical framework so they can make good decisions. And that's how I'm going to talk to all of you today. First, I'm going to talk about why Ukraine matters, why we should care. I think it's been extraordinary to see, especially among my students, how this has touched people who have no connection to Ukraine. But it's still important for us to know, beyond the emotion, why this really matters. It's not, the emotion matters, but it's not just emotions. Then I want to talk about why a common Europe has failed, why we came to this moment, why deterrence failed. One of the anchors of our stability in Europe has not simply been persuasion, it's been deterring bad behavior, especially by the Russians. Why did it fail in this case? And then where do we go from here? How do we think about where we go from here? So let me start with why Ukraine matters. And it's a basic historical geographical point. There are parts of the world, even in a digital space that we live in today, there are parts of the world that are hinges, as historians have written for 400 years, hinges of political stability. They seem to have repeated influence on the stability, the political organization, the economy of areas around them. They are often not the most valuable areas, but they are strategically located, which is to say they are attached and have influence on valuable areas around them. And there is no place in Europe that is more the case of than Ukraine. You could argue the Ruhr Valley, the source of coal and steel, was actually the source of wealth for much of Europe. But Ukraine has been the hinge of European stability, and people like Halfhold Mackinder and others were writing about this more than 100 years ago. Because of its location at the crossroads, because of the resource base it provides for foodstuffs and other items, and because it is an area that is between the two largest economic and political actors, Germany and Russia, and is easily navigable in a way that Switzerland isn't, or that Austria isn't. It has been a hinge for Europe, and it has been the cockpit of conflict, death, and destruction. All the bad things that we immediately associate with two world wars had their epicenter in Ukraine. They had their epicenter in Ukraine. So World War I was very much about who would control that area. With a declining Austro-Hungarian Empire, Russian expansion into this region that was partially the Austro-Hungarian Empire, partially the Ottoman Empire, had not traditionally been the Russian Empire. I'm sorry, Vladimir Putin, your facts are wrong. It was not traditionally part of the Russian Empire, but you had Russian expansion into this area and German expansion. The first arguments about German Lebensraum were actually made about this area. The most important Russian nationalist arguments about an expansionist role for Russia in Europe, the Westernizer arguments of the late 19th century, were made about this area. And so during World War I, you saw some of the most intensive fighting in this area and some of the most brutal fighting. The Eastern Front in World War I was far worse than the Western Front. And the whole solution at Versailles, the whole effort that Woodrow Wilson, David Lloyd George, Georges Clemenceau undertook was to try to find a new method for bringing stability to this region, bringing it through nation-state formation, through the creation of nation-states in this part of Europe, in Central Europe. The nation-states of Czechoslovakia, Hungary, all of which are new states bordering Ukraine, were designed to be bulwarks for stability in this area. And Russia, coming out of World War I, would have more influence in this area, but it was to be an area that was actually an area of non-military intervention. That, of course, failed. That's the failure of Versailles. And it's a failure in two dimensions. There's the Soviet side of that story, and there's the German side of that story. In the 1930s, people are now, I think, all reading about this, but a lot of Americans didn't know this. In the 1930s, Joseph Stalin intentionally starves more than 20 million people in Ukraine. And I've pointed this out to many audiences. We as Americans cannot understand 20 million deaths. We've had more than 1 million deaths from COVID. Think how bad that is. Multiply that by 20 for a population about half or a third the size of the entire Soviet Union in the 1930s. A population about a tenth the size in Ukraine. And imagine people starving to death. The deaths from COVID have been bad enough, but imagine starvation, forced starvation. Stalin collectivized the agriculture of Ukraine. And as a number of historians, a whole generation have shown, he intentionally did that to pull the industrial resources out of Ukraine and to let the Ukrainian population starve. So Soviet brutality in its most brutal form is centered here. And then during World War II, the German armies moved through Ukraine with Operation Barbarossa. And as many of you know, this was actually their most successful area moving through. The German armies arrived, and Ukrainians believed at first that the Germans were liberators because their experience under the Soviet Union was so horrible. And the Germans were even worse, if that's possible. Even worse, if that's possible. And were responsible for millions more deaths in Ukraine and a large Jewish population that now hardly exists. And it is terribly, tragically ironic when the Russian president today refers to this as a Nazi republic. If there was a country that was destroyed by Nazis after it was destroyed by communists, it was Ukraine. There's the irony, of course, that Zelensky himself is Jewish. There's hardly a Jewish population left because of what happened here. The settlement at the end of World War II was a settlement about Ukraine, not just about Germany. We all know about the division of Germany. But the discussions that occurred at Yalta and elsewhere were discussions that were keyed around Soviet control over this area, not because it was part of Russia, but to prevent any further fighting. And Ukraine was to be a republic within the Soviet Union with nominal independence. Of course, it didn't really have that, but it was not made part of Russia. That's really important. If this had been part of Russia, it would have been actually made part of Russia, but it wasn't. It was to be a satellite within the Soviet system for the purposes of stability in Europe. That's exactly how Franklin Roosevelt thought about it. That's exactly how Joseph Stalin talked about it. You can go back and read the transcripts at Yalta. That's exactly how they talked about it. And most historians, myself included, have written that actually this agreement that sentenced Ukraine to being within the Soviet Empire was actually one of the sources of a long peace in Europe, because it prevented war in Ukraine. That's the context for what happens in 1991 when the Soviet Union collapses, in part because Russians no longer want to pay the costs of empire. Remember, Boris Yeltsin is one of the moving factors in the collapse of the Soviet Union, not just Mikhail Gorbachev. It's not just about reform. It's about not paying the costs of empire. Ukraine and Ukrainians see themselves legitimately as having a claim on becoming an independent republic. There's nothing anti-Russian about that. There's nothing necessarily pro-Western about that. And as is recognized at the time, this area for Europe to remain peaceful has to be an area where foreign powers are not staging warfare. That if one side moves in militarily, it will trigger insecurity from the other side. And that's why Ukraine is encouraged to give up its nuclear weapons. We put a lot of money into removing, this is the Nunn-Lugar bill at the time, removing the weapons from Ukraine. And we invest in development of Ukraine, but the idea is not to create a militarized space. The idea is to create actually a functioning society that will be between the potentially warring entities. And I would say that for all the debates about NATO, and we can get into that, that system has kind of worked until now. And it's exactly that system that Vladimir Putin is trying to undermine. There's no other way to see this. Ukraine was not doing anything that was undermining Russian authority, insofar as Russian authority would be about Russia. But if you want to actually control more of Europe, then Ukraine, as an independent entity, was dangerous to Russia. It was dangerous to Russia also because it was democratizing. It was an imperfect, very imperfect democracy. Most of us would have said 3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago, Zelensky was a failed president. He's now become a hero. I was just telling a group the other day that the lesson from Winston Churchill is just get it right at the end. Winston Churchill gets everything wrong in his career until the very end, right? Get it right at the end, and that's what you'll be remembered for. Zelensky has found his moment also, and he's shown amazing courage, such outstanding courage and an ability to communicate in this moment. He has found his voice. But this was a developing democracy. And I think that was threatening to Putin as well. I think the future of European stability has always hinged in many ways on Ukraine and any kind of democratic future. And maybe those are the things that Vladimir Putin, I can't get in his head, but those have to be the things he wants to undermine by doing what he's doing. There's no other way, I think, to understand that. And I think that's why Ukraine matters. It's about much more than Ukraine. It's about the future of European security, European democracy. And how can Americans not care about that? How can we not? This is much more important than Iraq ever was. Much more important than Afghanistan ever was to the United States. Why did a common Europe fail? I bring this up because I want people to remember that there was discussion. All of you remember this. Students don't. They weren't around. There was really hope that there would be a common Europe in the 1990s. And I know Shelley was involved in a lot of these discussions, right? And we have to give Mr. Gorbachev credit. His goal, he used this phrase, a common Europe. So did Willy Brandt and Helmut Kohl, both sides of the political spectrum in Germany. So did Francois Mitterrand. This idea that there would finally be a Europe that was whole of different states that would cooperate with one another. And Russia would be part of that. Russia would be part of that. And this vision that I still find very attractive was a vision of a Europe that would be cooperative and would be about power sharing. Ralph Dahrendorf, one of the key thinkers in the creation of the European Union, put it very clearly. He said that the European model, in contrast to the American and Soviet model, would be a cooperative model. Capitalism, but capitalism built around cooperation. If you think about German capitalism, you can see that, right? In Germany, the unions get a seat at the table. They negotiate with the business leaders and government leaders. Everything is about a kind of negotiation. So workers get paid more and they get more vacation time, but businesses can count on workers to be productive in a way they aren't in other societies. So you have this cooperation, and government plays a role seeding that. You could call it a kind of collusion, right? But it's cooperation rather than competition, and it's capitalism that's keyed upon sharing resources, sharing power. And let's give the Germans credit. For an economy of their size, they have been remarkably willing to play by these rules, maybe not exactly as the Greeks wanted, but they have been willing to play by these rules to a great extent. And I'll remind everyone that after the Syrian crisis, Germany alone took in more immigrants than the United States. In fact, the city of Hamburg, where Olaf Scholz was the mayor at the time, the current Bundeskanzler was mayor, took in more Syrian immigrants than all the United States, just Hamburg alone. They have been sharing the burden. And I think what we see with Vladimir Putin, and this has been consistent, this is not a new phenomenon, we're seeing it now in a militarized form, is that he doesn't see Russia as playing a power sharing game in Europe. And I think it's because he sees that in a power sharing context, Russia will not be the first among equals or even close. There's no interest he's shown in power sharing around resources, no interest in power sharing around military affairs. Repeatedly, he has used his influence to undermine not just democratic processes, but efforts at building cooperative representative governments around Russia. Just the opposite. And I think one has to say that a common Europe has failed because Russia has refused to play along. Now, you could argue that at times Russia may not have been treated as fairly or exactly as it wanted to be treated. We can argue over that. But I think there's been a consistent pattern of Russia not wanting to see itself in the last 20 years as among equals in Europe, but instead as the first among equals, with resources and position that don't match that. So it's a classic case of a power with excessive ambitions, unwilling to play by the rules, the rules that make a lot of sense in a geopolitical environment. And this has been obvious for a long time. The hope was always, if you remember, the reset. Well, first, it was George W. Bush looking into Putin's soul. Then it was Hillary Clinton's idea of a reset. The hope was that at some point we could persuade the Russians that a power-sharing environment in Europe would be better for them. And Vladimir Putin has not been willing to buy into that. There are a lot of Russians I know who would buy into that, by the way. This is not a Russian cultural problem at all. This is a Russian leadership problem. This is a Russian leader, maybe a Russian dictatorship problem, is the way of putting it. I make this point because there's a long debate over whether regime type matters for international politics. I say yes. I say a more representative Russian regime might have been more willing to be power sharing in Europe rather than power dominant as it's trying. Okay, why did deterrence fail? I think one of the reasons Putin didn't do this earlier, I don't think this was a new idea on his part. I think his obsession with Ukraine goes back a long way. And he did, of course, invade Crimea in 2014. He invaded Georgia in 2007. He's been interfering in elections overseas. He's done a lot of aggressive things. But fundamentally, I think we have to take on that oftentimes regimes that have aggressive aims are restrained because of deterrence. It's not the only reason. But I do think you could argue that, and I think it's true, that NATO's deterrence prevented war at many key moments after World War II. The Berlin crisis, for example. I think it's quite clear in the records from Russia that the Soviet Union builds a wall in Berlin in 1961. because they see they have a problem of people leaving through Berlin, through East Berlin to the west. They're most talented, just what's happening with Russia now, most talented people leaving the country. They want to stop that from happening. They want to take control of West Berlin, but they don't want a war over it. I think Khrushchev would have tried to move in and just taken control of West Berlin, which was within East Germany, of course, if it weren't for the military deterrence that the United States and NATO provided. And so building a wall, as Khrushchev himself says, is better than a war. So deterrence is important. It's not the only thing. It's not just an argument for being tough guy all the time, but deterrence does seem to work. And I think we have failed in the last few years to deter. And I think we, in this case, have ourselves to blame, the United States, as well as many of our allies. I see no way of getting beyond the fact that Putin perceives that our divisions make it impossible for us to do what we have done the last 3 weeks. And I think he's still betting wrongly, I hope, that our internal divisions, our internal corruptions, our internal democratic deficiencies that I don't have to get into for this group, right? You have seen those the last few years, that those deficiencies would make it impossible for us to do what we've done. You might have thought it was impossible for us to do this 3 weeks ago. Tom Schelling, who I know Shelley knows a lot about as well, one of the real great thinkers about deterrence theory, one of the key minds behind nuclear deterrence during the Cold War. Tom Schelling famously wrote that deterrence is not about how strong your arsenal is, nor is it about how willing you are to use threatening rhetoric. Deterrence, he said, is about the credibility of your commitment. Are you able to follow through? And I think we sent a message to Vladimir Putin the last 4-5 years, maybe a little longer, that we were not willing to follow through. We had a president, the prior president, who was on his side at most moments. And internally, even those who were not on the side of our president at that time seemed so focused on other issues, so caught up on other things. I mean, I remind you that the first impeachment was about a president withholding weapons, the very weapons that are being used now from Ukraine, to get a foreign leader to provide him with dirt on his political opponent. And the interesting thing is that's not even denied by Republicans anymore. They just simply say it's not illegal. That's their defense now, that it was not impeachable. Just as the incitement of the insurrection on January 6th is not denied either. They don't deny that Trump gave the speech and that he encouraged people to do something about it. They just deny that it was illegal, that it was impeachable. If you all remember Mitch McConnell's statement when he voted against the second conviction after the second impeachment, his statement was that this was just not, it was not the right thing to impeach, not that Trump hadn't done the bad things. He admitted he had and said we shouldn't convict him for it. So, and you think about this from Vladimir Putin's perspective, when we're attacking our own Congress, when citizens from our society, not a single person I know of was not an American who did that, right, who attacked Congress. The 600 plus people who have been convicted, are, as far as I know, are all American citizens. The people who incited them were American citizens. How is he to think that we are willing to follow through on what had traditionally been pretty strong signals that any kind of behavior exactly like this would be met with strong action by us? And I believe, I can't prove this, but I think when Trump lost, he believed that he had a window of opportunity before Biden might be able to build a new consensus when he could act. And I'll remind you that the language of windows of opportunity was exactly what was used in World War I. It's not states that are confident that attack this way. It's states that think they're at their maximum position of strength and their enemies are at their maximum position of weakness right now, and it's going to get worse in the future, so they should act now. I think we spent the last 4 to 5 years sending a message to Vladimir Putin and others that we as a society were not able to do big things internationally, that we were not able to stand up for what had been our principles and our positions for a long time. And we should not be surprised that someone who had aggressive aims decided it was time to take advantage of that. And I think we need to own that. And I'm not making an argument for that we have to always agree and salute the flag. That's not at all what I'm arguing. I am arguing, though, that we have to invest in leadership that actually stands up for what we believe as a country, and invest in our alliances, and invests in our purposes internationally, and not let our domestic differences, our partisan differences, infect our basic security interests. Most of the Cold War, we were able to, despite partisanship, protect our basic security interests. We were able to show credibility in Tom Schelling's terms. I think we lost that credibility. We're rebuilding it perhaps now. But we need to take a long, hard look in the mirror and ask how we might have signaled that he could get away with this. Maybe even that we would support it. And I would remind you, there still are a few, but initially when he invaded, there were more than a few voices defending him. And again, I'm all for policy differences, but defending this kind of attack on someone else is quite an extraordinary thing to do. So where do we go from here? That's of course the most difficult question to answer. I'll tell you where I don't think we go. I don't think this is a problem the United States will fix alone. I know that because historically, any problem we've ever fixed, we never fixed alone. Unilateralism does not work historically. I think Shelley would agree with me on that. Unilateralism does not work. It's the paradox of international affairs. As powerful, as rich as you are, you still don't control the world. I mean, have we not learned that in Afghanistan and Iraq? And did we not learn that in Vietnam? Did we not really learn that in Korea also? I mean, do we have to keep relearning this lesson, right? So the answer to Putin is not the United States coming over the hill, John Wayne-like, as much as that's a nice story to tell, right? And the answer is not, I think, to look away either and say it doesn't matter. We have to face the reality of this. I think where we go from here is more of a lot of what we're doing, and then more on that in new ways, right? I think we have to rebuild what has been the single most successful thing we've done for the 70 years before this, is building a Western alliance of like-minded, though not entirely like-minded countries that are willing to use their resources to deter and to encourage the kinds of change that they want. It's not just about supporting Zelensky. It's about actually supporting European security and Western democracy and putting our resources behind that in every way possible. And I think that involves offering opportunities to Ukrainians who are leaving Ukraine as well, with the hope that they will have places to go to be trained and return in one way or another. I think we have to invest in power sharing in Europe. We have to show, as we did during the Cold War, that as imperfect as we are, we're a better alternative than others. Dean Acheson, I think one of our greatest secretaries of state, said this in 1951. He said, for all of our failings, we are, quote, fortunate in our enemies. We are far from perfect. Let's not pretend we're perfect. Boy, are we far from perfect right now as a society. But boy, oh boy, we can also create and show that we're a better alternative. This whataboutism has to go, right? We have to show that we care, that we can be humanity, that we can be humane, that we actually believe in representative government. We've got to, as George Kennan said, the great thinker about containment, it is not our policies abroad, but what we stand for at home that make us most persuasive to those abroad. We have to remember who we are. We have to stand up for who we are. It's almost more important, right, how we show what we are than what we actually try to build. We're not very good at building it ourselves, but we can model it, is I guess what I'm saying. And I think we have to be willing to make long-term investments. And I think this is the moment now to say that many of the dependencies we've created on energy from petrostates, stuff that's already ruining the environment, there's now a strategic reason to invest in alternatives. We did a very good job during the Cold War of not becoming dependent upon particular states like the Soviet Union. We shouldn't be dependent upon them today. There's more of an argument than ever, I think. Not for energy independence, that's a myth, right? But for liberating ourselves from dependence that we have had really since the 1970s on a series of petrostates that we all know act aggressively and undemocratically in ways that run against our interests. Another one of them, named Saudi Arabia, killed an American journalist, right? Khashoggi. And we've done nothing about it, right? And we can go on and make a long list. I'm not saying overnight we can liberate ourselves from this, but there are a number of strategic places, that's one of many, where we as a community of democratic societies can say we're going to invest in disempowering these other countries. We cannot do that with China. We are too economically dependent on China. There are ways we can still maintain certain elements of independence. We can certainly do that with Russia. We can certainly do that with some of the Middle East petrostates that we're too dependent on. And then the last thing, and the thing that you're doing and why I'm so excited to speak to you, is I think it's time we start educating Americans about these issues again. One of the most discouraging things for me is the nativism in our society that we've all felt recently. And we have to start standing up more for that, standing up more against that, right? We cannot allow our society to become so inward looking that we neglect our understanding of these issues. This should be a moment to obviously, I'm going to say this, teach more history, right? To get people more educated. I'm so impressed with all the work that Shelley does. I'm going to brag on him here through Model UN, through other organizations, to do exactly this. I think this is what the Osgood Center is doing at Johns Hopkins, right? And I think more of this needs to be done. We have been underinvesting in this. Let me just give you two examples of how we need to reverse this, very concrete examples. Most of our schools still do not teach a wide range of foreign languages. I mean, middle schools and high schools. Most Americans come to college. They're more qualified than ever in the math and science dimension, less qualified than ever. I tell you, I see their applications in history, language, and writing. Think about how many schools, middle schools that have the football coach teaching history, no foreign languages being taught, and really good teachers teaching math and science. I'm not against math and science teaching at all. But we need an educated citizenry that knows the world, understands the world, thinks about the world. And it's more difficult than ever also because of a pandemic that's made it impossible for people to travel for the last 2 years, right? So the study abroad programs haven't been running. My kids were supposed to go to camps in Germany and Spain last year. Obviously, they didn't go, right? All these things, right? We need to double down on having an educated citizenry that speaks languages, that understands the world, and doesn't try to see the world just from an American navel-gazing perspective. And I can't help but say, if you only want to teach the history that you love, you are not teaching people to be prepared for the wider world. One of the things that the people attacking the teaching of history are trying to do is to get us not to talk about the problems of immigration and the challenges of American activities overseas. Other people know those stories. I've never met an Iranian who didn't know about the coup we sponsored in 1953. I've never met a Southeast Asian who doesn't know a lot about the Vietnam War. Do you think there's anyone in Iraq who doesn't know about the Iraq War? How are we going to prepare our future leaders if we don't educate them about these things, right? We love our country. We should love it so much that we teach people to learn about our flaws and limitations so they are prepared internationally to address those flaws and limitations that are seen most clearly, often by people overseas, right? We are a society that has been inclusive, but also racist. Other societies see that. They have people who have confronted that in our society. We need to be prepared to address that. I think where we go from here is by fundamentally doubling down on a phrase that Shelley and others have used for a long time: internationalism. Internationalism. We need to be more invested in our society as an international actor, as a positive actor, as a cooperator with other societies. And that's exactly what Vladimir Putin is afraid of. And so I'll close on that note. I don't have short-term solutions, but I think I'm reminded by what we're living through now of some, I think, historically tried and true things that we could do to at least begin to move the ball forward and reverse some of the really dangerous trends that we are witnessing in the world today. And I'm optimistic we can do that. I'm optimistic that I'll close on this point. I have a note here: be optimistic. So I'm going to close on this point, right? That our students at a place like the University of Texas here, they care deeply about what's happening in Ukraine. They don't know why, but they do. Any event we do on campus, we get hundreds of students who want to come voluntarily. That's not always the case. They care deeply. This is a time, this is an opportunity. Let's build on that. Let's build on that. Let's think about how we can use this moment to actually educate and improve ourselves, not just deal with the headlines in front of us. I'll leave it there. I apologize if I spoke too long.
No, Jeremy, you finished right on time, but I want you to extend your thoughts just a little bit, because it's been a while since terms like deterrence and credibility have been used in public lectures. And you and I do it all the time, but it's not part of our everyday existence. But you haven't really addressed the nuclear shadow that hovers over this whole question, and that's where Schelling began his discussions about deterrence. And the conundrum here is that to avoid nuclear war, you almost have to threaten it. You have to contemplate it, and Putin has rattled the nuclear sword at us. And the question is Putin rational? Can he be deterred, or is he willy-nilly? Is there method in his madness, and how do you respond to those who are just flat afraid now that the nuclear genie is out of the bottle, that the clock is moving closer to midnight?
It's a terrific question, Shelley, and I've been trying to talk to a lot of people who are sort of on the inside about this. I know you have as well. I think there's no evidence, first of all, yet that Putin has done anything but talk. There's no evidence that he's moved or adjusted any weapons. But the talk about it alone is scary, is really scary, as you say. And there's every reason to believe that he's willing to be aggressive and sacrifice a lot of lives. I think there are 3 points that are motivating our policy today that all go back to Tom Schelling, right? So the first one is nuclear weapons are largely unusable, especially in this kind of conflict. Right, to use a nuclear device, even a small tactical device, would contaminate a large area in which Russian soldiers are operating, an area where that Putin himself wants to take control of. So it's hard to think of a strategic way to use these weapons. What Putin is suffering from right now is he doesn't have enough well-trained soldiers to do the basic work of occupation, and this would make it worse. So they become instead, again, Tom Schelling term that you know well, weapons of terror, not weapons of strategic use, right? A tank has strategic purpose. You can occupy an area with a well-functioning tank. A nuclear weapon in this context only terrorizes people. And so then you get to the question of rationality. Is that what he's trying to do? Is he trying to terrorize people? We don't know. There's every reason to believe that although he's isolated and made some poor judgments, that he's not suicidal. There's not evidence that he's looking to be a martyr in any sense. So it probably is posturing. And so we have to think about it, again, back to Schelling, in terms of what's the right posture now to discouraging him from continuing to raise the ante. And I think it's the right thing for us to not go tit for tat. When he makes a nuclear threat, we should not make a nuclear threat back, because all that does is create a more escalating rhetoric, right? We went through this a little bit in North Korea, right? Where North Koreans tested a weapon and then the president said, we have a bigger one than yours, and we go back and forth. I think the best thing to do is what we are doing, which is showing that our forces are ready if they have to be used, and making it quite clear that if any weapon is used in any context, or even there's evidence of preparation to use that weapon, that would trigger a much stronger response from us. We have communicated, I know, to Russian military leaders that they will be held personally accountable for that. This is a war crime, without question, to consider using a nuclear weapon in this context. They would be held personally responsible. And we have to make it clear that any act like that would be enough to trigger a concerted effort at regime change on our part. And that's why we're avoiding that rhetoric now. I think it's very dangerous, Shelley, when someone like Senator Lindsey Graham says we should put a bullet in Putin's head. Whether you believe that or not, we want to show him that we're not about regime change now. He can lose a war and leave it to the Russian people to decide. But if he goes another level that you're talking about, then everything's on the table for us as well. And I don't mean we would respond nuclear. I mean, we would take out his regime, and we could. There are a lot of things we could do that he would not want us to do. So that has to be on the table, but it does not have to be about escalating threats. And then the other thing I'll say that I think is implied by your question, Shelley, is this reminds us that when we get through this, we have to come back to the issue that you've spent a lot of time thinking about: nuclear arms control. Having these weapons, and so many of them, is an inherently dangerous thing.
Indeed.
I find it interesting that India, Saudi, South Africa, and maybe other nations are tacitly also supporting Putin, as well as China, but we don't hear about them.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Sheldon, and I would include Israel to some extent in that category also. I think there are a lot of countries that I wouldn't say they're supporting Putin, but they're not opposing him. They're not taking the kind of more rigorous action we would like, and they all have their own short-term interests and reasons why they're doing that. I think our goal has been, I wish those countries would think differently, so let's start with that. But I think our goal and our policy is not trying to turn them around. It's trying to get them to go from tacit support, as you say, to neutrality, to just staying out, not helping him. And the most clear example of that is where I think Biden is trying, we'll see if it works. He's trying to make it clear to the Chinese that they shouldn't support Putin. And I think so far the Chinese have not given Putin a lot of support. They're going to continue to buy his oil, but he needs weapons. He needs help. And as long as they don't help him, that's a benefit. Would I prefer if the Chinese came on our side on this? Of course. But, as Franklin Roosevelt said during World War II, right? It's not always about friends versus enemies. It's making sure the enemies have fewer friends. And I think that's what we're trying to do. And we can be, I think, very influential in that context. And that's the reality of our world.
Yeah, I had a question about Israel because, our tax dollars support their defense. But I'm just wondering why they're not imposing sanctions on Russia and why they don't help send weapons to Ukraine, like the Iron Dome and other things that people have reported in the news.
Natalie, it's a great question. I, first of all, agree with you. They should do those things. And I will say, as an American Jew, I have been very disappointed in Israel in the last few years. And I think Israel has adopted a set of policies that the new government still, at least the current prime minister, still believes are appropriate in emphasizing their strength in the Middle East above all else. And I'm not for a weak Israel, by the way, but I think they're going too far in that direction. And they believe that in dealing with Syria and other issues, Russia is a key player. And they are valuing that much more highly than what I think they should value, which is the connection they have to Ukraine. There are hundreds of thousands, if not more, Ukrainian Jews in Israel. This is their legacy, and so I find this almost offensive. But I understand what's going on there. This is part of a long-term Israeli commitment, not to the issues that Israel used to be committed to, but to being a strong power in the Middle East. Period. End of sentence.
And not supporting a democracy, I guess, in this case.
No, and not supporting the protection of citizens, some of whom are Jews, who are being attacked by a traditionally anti-Semitic power in anti-Semitic ways. Look at what Putin is saying, right? He's calling the Jewish president of Ukraine a Nazi. He's justifying intervention there by saying these are lesser than Russian people, that he has the right to rule. I mean, you don't have to deeply investigate history to see the parallels with what other anti-Semitic aggressors have done. And the fact that Israel is not on the side of protecting what I think are long-term Jewish interests in sovereignty and non-aggression by countries like Russia, that's really problematic for me as an American Jew. It says that the priorities are mixed up, and that's not going to change right now. It might change when this coalition government flips and you get the other prime minister in. But there's been a real shift in Israel in our lifetime, Natalie, and toward different values than the values I used to associate as an American Jew with Israel.
Yeah, thank you very much. It was a very powerful and thoughtful presentation. I really appreciated it.
Thank you, Natalie.
Why has the West not put up any specific red lines to Putin to stop this massacre? Unless that message is given, I believe that he will never stop killing people.
So it's a great question, Mahindra. I think we have to be careful with red lines, that we don't create a red line that we then aren't willing to follow up on.
Fair enough.
And so one of the things Biden has done very well, and I'm going to be meeting with a bunch of diplomats tomorrow, actually, but what I think they're going to say to me is that he has very well brought people together who don't agree on a red line. And so you have to be careful if you articulate a red line that everyone in this group of countries doesn't agree on, then you end up separating and losing people. So sometimes vagueness is how you hold your side together. And yeah.
Can you think of those red lines?
Well, one would be nuclear. One would be to move and use anything that's a nuclear or chemical weapon. So he's made that clear recently. Maybe Biden could be even clearer that chemical and biological weapons will be seen as something different, right? They have intelligence. I haven't seen the intelligence. Maybe Shelley has. They have intelligence which seems to indicate that Putin is preparing to use chemical and biological weapons. And one of the pieces of evidence is he's claiming that the Ukrainians are doing that. Usually when he claims someone else is doing something, it's because he wants to do it. So we are trying to create a red line there. I think that one could imagine a red line about civilian deaths and attacks on civilians. It's certainly an international legal line. He has crossed that line in the last week, clearly. But the problem is you've got to have everyone in your coalition agreeing on that line. And the other thing, Mahindra, is you don't want to tell him he can go up to that line. That's the other part of it. I think. Sorry, I'm sorry. Go ahead, sir.
JFK moment versus Khrushchev hasn't been seen so far. I would like to see that happening actually somehow.
I agree. It was a little, when it's about moving one set of weapons, it's a little different from a war like this. I do think we've given him one red line, though. We've made it clear that these sanctions that we have imposed, which are tougher than any sanctions that are destroying the Russian economy before our eyes, that these sanctions will not be lifted until he ceases the aggressive invasion. I think that's clear. I don't think that's going to convince him, but I think that's clear. I think he's betting that we won't hold together on this. But that is the way we have talked about these sanctions. There's no way these sanctions are going to be lifted so long as he's attacking places in Ukraine.
Munya has a question here, and it's a two-parter question, so I'm going to try to synthesize it for you. It's a little bit of Monday morning quarterbacking 32 years down the line. Was there a tactic mistake in telegraphing what NATO and the EU, what eventually would become the EU, would do regarding Ukraine?
Yes and no. I mean, I think that the thing we did that's extraordinary, and I think the person who deserves credit for this, who will get a lot of credit for this, I think, is Bill Burns, who's the head of the CIA now. I think Shelley knows him as well. He was the ambassador, the U.S. ambassador to Russia, longtime diplomat. He's the one at the CIA who recognized that we should start doing what we had never done before, which is release our intelligence in advance to show the world what Putin was planning. And I think that telegraphing of what we knew helped to build this coalition. It helped to prevent Putin from claiming that he was provoked or whatever. We showed he was planning this for months, and we've controlled the narrative, not he. So that's what we've done well. But I do think we conveyed to him unintentionally that we were uncertain and that we were not going to get militarily involved in Ukraine. And of course, we weren't directly. I think he took that to mean we weren't going to send the kind of military support. And I think we might have been able to do a better job in retrospect of making it clear how well trained some of the Ukrainians were, how many weapons we had given them and were willing to give them, and how they would resist. Maybe we could have educated him. This is, if I could reverse the clock, I would spend more time explaining to Putin how effective Ukrainian resistance could be. Because that really hasn't surprised people. What has surprised people who follow these things closely is how poorly trained and prepared the Russians were. But Ukrainian resistance.
Extend that thought. That's the most remarkable thing.
Yeah.
And it also leads to the possibility of risk taking that could be dangerous.
I agree with you 100%. I mean, part of it, Shelley, is the classic case of a dictatorship where no one wants to tell the emperor he has no clothes.
Yeah.
Everyone tells him what he wants to hear. And so the real problems within the military were not addressed. There are two that everyone in the U.S. military is telling me about, and I'm sure telling you. One, the Russian army is filled with poorly paid conscript soldiers. very poorly paid. They are not well trained, well informed. They don't know why they're
Well
there.
fed,
Yeah,
blah, blah, blah.
exactly. And
Yeah.
and I'm sure there are people on this call who have been in military circumstances. Training is everything, and they have numbers, but they don't have training. They don't have morale. They don't know what to do. Second, and perhaps even more important, they underestimated their enemy. This is again terrible analysis, wishful thinking, the emperor being told what the emperor wants to see, and they assumed they would win fast and that they wouldn't need to do all the things you need to do to conduct basic operations, such as providing enough fuel for your tanks, having supply lines. And so I think those two things combined, terrible planning and terrible training. And in contrast, the Ukrainians are pretty well trained to resist. They're not well trained to go into someone else's territory, but they know how to resist. They've got a lot of experience, and we've trained them. So I think that's what you're seeing at some level. It's sort of what Pete Drucker says in the business community, right? Culture eats everything else alive, right? It's the organizational culture that matters.
The second part of Wanya's question was about the internally displaced people. You know, what do you see as a way forward politically and economically?
Yeah, that's a really tough issue, right? Millions of people displaced, and the numbers are only going to continue to grow. I think it's about time we, as a world community, recognize this issue and start doing things to open our borders for immigrants. It's extraordinary how much more support there is for that now than there was in Syria. And I can't get past the fact that the Ukrainians are white and the Syrians were Muslim, and that seems to be a difference in the way people view things. We've made some progress. Japan, this certainly floored me. I'm sure it floored a lot of you. Is actually taking in Ukrainian immigrants. The Japanese don't ever take in immigrants.
Don't ever take any. Ever.
Yeah. So, but we need to make this not a one-off situation. We need to have a global conversation. This needs to be a UN effort to create better circumstances for immigrants, to open borders for them, to provide resources, to share resources. We should be sharing resources with poorer societies that are helping take immigrants in. That should be part of the discussion, not just giving weapons.
How is it that a rogue criminal nation like this remains on the Security Council? I believe they were admitted to the Security Council when they were the Soviet Union.
That's correct.
And so how does Russia keep that seat, particularly in light of the current situation?
Well, Shelley's more of an expert on this than I am, but I will say that as the historian in me says that the problem we have with the United Nations, that this is one element of, is it's frozen in time. The Security Council represents the power decisions that were made at the San Francisco Conference in 1945, and there's no mechanism for getting a permanent member of the Security Council off. For a while, it wasn't the PRC that held the Chinese seat. That was changed in 1971. And there's no, the Russians inherited the Soviet seat. And the United States allowed that at the time. It seemed like a sensible thing in 1991. And now we're stuck with it. And I think we need, and I'm going to turn it over to Shelley on this, I think we need fundamental reform of the United Nations. How that happens is only going to be when enough of the countries say, not only are we angry with this, but we're actually going to invest in creating a new UN charter that will address these issues. Shelley, is that on the right line?
Well, yeah, across the board, there needs to be reform of various international organizations. And you need to add one step to the 1991 denuclearization of Ukraine and the creation of the new independent states also allowed Russia to continue in the position of Security Council member. And
Yes.
Getting a nation off of the Security Council is very difficult because they still have a veto with regard to that. We actually need to have a new Bretton Woods of some kind to talk about what's going to be going on. And you, as you say, Jeremy, it can't be done alone. It can't be the United States doing that. There has to be a consistent movement, and it will be very difficult to do that. But reform in the Security Council by adding nations or rethinking the veto might be the way to go, as opposed to just removing. But there's been no consensus at all regarding what form that could come to the Security Council. We state our positions and they stay in place because so many different permanent members can veto whatever happens next. And so that's where we are. I think, though, what's happening now will lead to some sort of reform effort.
I hope so. I hope so.
It won't argue for India's participation as a permanent member of the Security Council. But in any event, everything's open right now. The Non-Proliferation Treaty now is open.
That's right.
Because it's going to lead to rethinking national security postures by a number of different states.
Well, I am pleased and proud to let you know that in recognition of your appearance before us today, we will be planning a tree in your honor in our nation's capital, signifying our commitment to improve and beautify the environment. You will be getting a cute certificate, but also the coordinates, the GPS coordinates of where your tree will be planted. Thank you so much. We appreciate you being here today.
Thank you.
Next.